Greetings. My name is Eli Anderson, and I am the director of a company called StoryAid. I'm collaborating with an amazing company known as the International Network for Health Workforce Education, and they have brought together across Europe some of the cutting-edge educators in healthcare education. And together we've formed an initiative, an EU initiative known as StoryAidEU, well, the StoryAidEU initiative. And we're looking at humanizing healthcare. I have this privilege of being able to share with you a number of things today. And those two things are two theories, one called the global reference theory and one called the quantum dynamic spatial architecture. But let me digress a little bit. Why the StoryAid initiative, EU initiative? Well, we certainly believe that in the current healthcare environment across Europe requires a more holistic approach. We also believe that storytelling is a critical tool to enable the hidden and the silent stories of vulnerable people to be heard. It is a great collaborative venture that supports interprofessional approaches. And for those who work and train in healthcare, it provides an opportunity to experience and understand the value of becoming a care or a healing community. And it also involves the loved ones within that framework. Now, StoryAid's mission is to enable people to reconnect and rediscover their inner stories. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by creating safe spaces for life-changing stories. Now, let me tell you a little bit about StoryAid and certainly how we see the human being, and then we'll talk in brief about the global reference theory and the quantum dynamic spatial architecture. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to call it the QDSA. Now, the triadic asyli is really three things. We believe that the human being has three fundamental areas to be human. The first is the physical, the second is the emotion/mental capacity, and the third is the spiritual. Now, each one of those interacts with each other, and they have an investment in each other, so to speak. And it's important that when we work with other human beings, we recognize that these things need to be in balance. We need to be connecting with each other. It's not holistic if we're only looking at the physical and we're looking at fixing the physical, the broken leg or whatever. And then we don't take note of the emotional well-being or the mental well-being of that person, but also their spiritual well-being. We need to take note of all those three things. And once we take note of that, then we're beginning to look at the holistic person. But also then we begin to look at how we as individuals look after ourselves in those three areas. And how we as individuals, if we look after those three in ourselves, we're able to look after those three in the other person. And if we have many individuals doing that, that's where we get this care community, this everybody has an investment in the community of that person. That includes also the loved ones, because they have a role to play in the development and the support and the recovery of that individual. And certainly in my last sessions, we were talking about loved ones and how critical they are to the well-being of the patient, certainly in the stroke ward that I was working in. But that kind of leads me very interestingly now to the idea of the global reference. I spoke to you a bit earlier on about the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual. Now, if you can imagine, that's a triadic acyli, but also is the global in the reference theory, because global is talking about the complete human being. And within that, each person, this is how story making or the story brain, the story making takes place in that space. It's about how we communicate. It's about seeing the context of that human being communicating. It's looking at the different cultural ecologies that are taking place. How do we recognize? How do we see that other person? How do we understand who they are? How do we interact with them? But what is fascinating is that I believe that the story creation, the development, the way in which creates story, we have a very early experience of how to do that on a genetic level. Unfortunately, I can't really develop that piece, that bit of it, but essentially, global reference theory is talking about how we create story with each other. And how we create story with each other is so dependent on who we are as people, our emotional, our physical and spiritual way in which we're working with it ourselves, so that we can engage in the emotional, physical and spiritual context from one triadic acyli to another, in a way. So when you look at the theory, the global reference theory, there are many, many ways in which people are interacting within that global. They need to find references on how to communicate, i.e. reference. How do we communicate? How do I recognize you? How do I see what's important to you? How am I recognizing my power? How does my power have an effect upon you and the way that you speak to me? And we want to talk about trauma a little bit later on, but we have to recognize that we come to create story, and creating story is not actually levels out the power. So you may have somebody who initiates story, but actually what that person is supposed to be doing is not just initiating it, but finding a way where there's communication. Obviously, one person has more knowledge of a particular thing, but what it is in the creation, in the way that we can reference each other, the way that we can create story, is that we get to understand who we are as people. That's the holistic bit of it. So as we talked about the quantum dynamic spatial architecture is coupled with that. So you've got the story creation part, and then you've got the part that actually talks about how we can involve people to make them feel safe. And we do that through space. Now imagine that the space between me and you now is not empty, but fluidic. There's fluid between us. There's a gas between us that we are breathing. So there isn't anything in there. It's just like fish. They live in a space which is water. We live in a space which is gas. And on a very physical level, gases can be excited to be hot and be cool. Things can transfer across a gas, like sound, rhythm, how we behave can be transmitted across through space. So you begin to understand that actually, when we talk about spatial architecture, we're talking about how the space can be transformed, can be formulated, can be constructed, and how can we engage in that construction of the space. And I talked about earlier how people are story creating. Now, what this does here is form the basis for how that story can be created. So if we look at the bed, the bed in the ward, if I'm walking into that space to support somebody, I'm negotiating a number of different architectures in getting towards the bed. So the first architecture is the building, the second is the reception, the third is the way I can get to it, the fourth is about the ward, the fifth is the next. All these things have to be negotiated. All these things have specific spaces, and all those spaces are to do with power. What sort of power do you have? What role, responsibility do you have? And there are many such roles which constitute an ecology, a spatial ecology. And that spatial ecology leads to a way that people engage with that space and engage with people, but also a recognition of power, what power these roles and responsibilities have. Now, one of the things about creating a holistic way of dealing with a human being, but also creating a community of care, is that each person is clear about the power they have, and they can give away that power. They give away that power in order to create story. So I know that the way I can engage with you is to ensure that you have space that you can define as your own. Very simple. There is a human space around us, whether we like it or not, that defines how close people get to us. And in the relationships that we have with people, we collapse the space to where we have loved ones or people that love us or we love them. And that's really important, that the way that we interact in that space allows people to interact and create story. So as I approach a person, a vulnerable person, I will ask them, do I have the permission to move closer to you? Do I have the permission to speak to you? So I'm being very aware that everything that I'm doing activates that space and allows that person to then allow me and give me permission to get closer. But also what it does, it defines the fact that this person has a space, has a permissible space that I have to be permitted. Doesn't matter how much power I have, that I am connected with that person. But the way I connect is to develop those relationships. They don't happen overnight. They happen over a period of time. And so that's the two theories in a bit of a nutshell. Now, what is critical about these theories is that they lead to life-changing spaces. They have a way of making life so exciting for the person because they see that they have a role to play in their development. They have a role to play in the way that they can get better, which is unique to somebody else. A little bit about the QDSA is that there are 4 kind of ways in which a QDSA works. And really it's about distance, which I've talked to you about. The kind of, one example is the bed. The second bit is the environment, a recognition of the environment and how that is constructed. A third is the ecology, how people interconnect with each other. What are the roles? What are the responsibilities? From the person that cleans right up to the person that makes a decision about money and where that money goes. That's part of the ecology. And it doesn't exist just laterally, it exists horizontally. So that's why it's a little bit more complex to recognize where that is in order for you to look at how you are supporting that person. And the other thing, and I alluded to it earlier, was how we enter those spaces, allowing people to connect with us. And what that really means is that we get a sense of who we are, what we are about, those three things, the triad exili, they apply to the person giving the support, as well as enabling those people to emerge with that support system within them. So we're reinforcing that so that we can engage with that person on a almost flat canvas. We are beginning to create a way of supporting them with their buy-in, their understanding, their permission. We're doing that. So we are entering into that relationship saying, this is our responsibility to help you get better. It's our responsibility. It's not mine as the health professional, and it's not all down to you. It's actually, how do we communicate? How do we create story? How do I find a way of navigating this space by building an architecture that through which we can communicate? So that's how those two things work, the QDSA and the GRT. GRT, story making, story construction. QDSA is about how do we build those relationships? How do we build that? How do we use that? And we're using that through space. We're activating space by being aware of our own humanity and the things that are important to us, such as our culture, our heritage. They're critical. They cannot be dissected from the person. If anything, those spiritual contexts with the person are critical to the development of the other person. So I hope you get an idea of the exciting way in which these things can operate together. You've got the story making and the story relationship construction, the GRT and the QDSA. I really hope that this makes you curious, makes you want to know more. I'm certainly excited in this collaboration, and I'm certainly excited to find that there may be other people out there who want to experience and learn more about this. But I'd also like to say a major, major, major thank you to the International Network for Health Workforce Education for this opportunity and to be working with amazing people and people who believe in the humanization of healthcare. Thank you for listening.